All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine Mitchell. I'm the Dean of the Social Sciences, and it is my great pleasure to introduce the proceedings today. This is the first of 4 lightning talk panel sessions that we're going to be holding, highlighting the naming of College 10 for Representative John R. Lewis and celebrating his incredible legacy. These panel sessions will be followed by a spring dedication event that we are still working on, and we will send out those details as soon as we have them. So I'd like to begin this afternoon with the land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking UP tribe, the Ama Mutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. We'll just take one moment to let that history resonate with us. Many of you already know the special relationship colleges 9 and 10 have with the social sciences, so I will just touch on this briefly. College 9 opened its doors in fall quarter of 2000 and College 10 in fall of 2002. Both colleges in many respects harken back to the earlier visioning of the residential colleges as centers of interdisciplinary excitement, intellectual stimulation, and student projects. The colleges were intended to make the campus feel smaller and more intimate, and to allow students to build community and have a close relationship with faculty, with other students, and with staff. Well, some of the colleges on our campus may have lost this sense of community and intimacy. We have managed to hold on to it, largely because of our superb staff leaders and provosts, but also I think because of the close relationship with the social sciences, which we have carefully guarded for the last 2 decades. That connection means that we have been able to continue and build things like the Co-Curricular Center, affectionately called the COCO, the Leadership Certificate Program, the Practical Activism Conference, the International Living Center, Alternative Spring Break, the Garden Project, and many other amazing intellectual and political projects and service programs. How wonderful, how truly amazing that we can now not just sustain, not just expand, but continue to innovate within the context of these powerful traditions and this legacy of intimate care for our students, for our deep and committed community engagement, and for social and racial justice. We can do this through the naming of College 10 for John R. Lewis, whose own history and activist work over decades provides a beacon for ongoing and sustained effort in these areas. And we can do this through the generous endowment that has been given by our far-sighted donors as part of this naming gift. This event tonight, which is brought to you by Colleges 9 and 10 and the Institute for Social Transformation, units under the Division of Social Sciences, is a testament to all of the hard and important work we do in the social sciences as well as across campus. This is the work of calling out injustice and inequity in every sphere of life, including here, whether that be racially unjust campus budgeting models and allocations of resources, as I pointed out in a recent Cal Matters op-ed, seemingly progressive but actually harmful school policies, such as one of our speakers, Professor Shange, speaks to in a recent book, or ongoing problems in our systems of criminal justice, migration, policing, housing, voting, and many other areas, as addressed by many of our faculty, as well as some of our speakers today. So thank you for joining us this evening for what is clearly necessary trouble, thinking with the legacy of John R. Lewis. I am delighted to now turn this over to Provost Flora Liu and Senior Director of College Student Life, Sarah Woodside Burry.
Thank you, Dean Mitchell, and welcome everyone. My name is Flora Liu, and I'm Provost of College 9 and College 10 in Faculty in Environmental Studies.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Woodside-Burry, and I'm the Senior Director of College Student Life here at College 9 and College 10, soon to be John R. Lewis College. Together, we co-lead College 9 and College 10. Our partnership across academic and student life sides reflect the unique living and learning community that is the college system here at UC Santa Cruz and on our campus. At College 10, our theme is social justice and community, and it imbues all that we do, from the Practical Activism Conference, organized by students, which is in just 10 days, so mark your calendar, to community engaged research projects about environmental justice and educational equity, to student facilitated courses with action projects addressing pressing societal issues.
In this event series, Necessary Trouble, that kicks off this afternoon, we showcase some of the voices in the UC Santa Cruz campus and the larger community whose research, teaching, activism, and craft resonate with John Lewis's notion of necessary trouble, a call to action that he described as, quote, get in trouble for the greater good, and to choose, quote, community over chaos.
So we would like to share just a few details about how our event will take shape this afternoon. First, we'll start by opening comments from our moderator, Dr. Shange, and then lightning talks by our panelists. And then we will have a moderated discussion with Q&A with the audience. So we also want to call your attention to the digital handout that is in the chat if you're joining us virtually, or was at the welcome table for those of you who are in person. There's a QR code. So make sure you get that. It has all the bios of all of our presenters for this evening or this afternoon, excuse me. And then we'd like students in the audience to ask their questions first. So we'd really like to center your voices. So if you are a student, please flag that for us. In the chat, you can do so, naming that you're students before you ask your question. And for those of you in the room, we'd love to make space for our students to ask the questions first. And then you can go ahead and add your questions at any time in the Q&A box if you are joining us virtually. And then we wanted to also let you know that this evening's or this afternoon's event is all going to be recorded as well, so you can come back to it at your leisure.
Thanks. So I'm delighted to introduce the moderator of our event this afternoon, Dr. Savannah Shange. Dr. Shange is an assistant professor of anthropology here at UC Santa Cruz, and her 2019 book entitled Progressive Dystopia: Abolition, Anti-Blackness, and Schooling in San Francisco is the winner of the Gregory Bateson Book Prize in the Society of Cultural Anthropology. This book has been described as a reviewer as a, quote, rich theoretical text, as an abolitionist manifesto, and perhaps most importantly, as an extended love letter to Black peoples. Welcome, Dr. Shange.
Thank you so much for that, Flora and Sarah, and to everyone who's here. Feel like I need to start ritually. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the name of John Lewis, under the banner of Black liberation pedagogy, which to me is to ask, what does John Lewis continue to teach us about what it means to get free? This is a man who was arrested 45 times over the course of his life and his struggle for our collective freedom. That's 45 times to feel the cool touch of handcuffs against his skin. 45 times he put his fleshy mortal body between the state and its armed agents, at least the 45 times they bothered to write it up. And so I don't know if in the Zoom, if people are able to raise their hand and whatnot, but whether you're in the Zoom or you're in this room, has anyone here been arrested? Okay, what about harassed or taunted by police? Right now, in this moment, imagine that you're walking down the block where you live and a police car rolls by you. Do you sense relief because you know they're there to protect you? Or do you sense terror because you know that they don't have to? Maybe it's a mix of both, particularly for those of us who travel across and across and beyond these lines like John Lewis did. My very first week working here at UC Santa Cruz, I had that sensation. I was pulled over for speeding right down here on Coolidge Drive. The sworn campus police officer wanted to ask me about my new car, how long I'd had it, how long I'd been a staff member. I wanted to ask him if I was going to live to make it home to see my kid. And I'm a college professor at one of the most progressive campuses in the country, right? I'm not a 20-year-old kid getting spat on, punched, beaten, kicked at a lunch counter in Nashville in 1960 as John Lewis was the first time he was arrested. I bring this here. I know it may seem like a dark place to start, but John Lewis knew intimately the terror of the police encounter because he faced it over and over again. He faced it when his skull was cracked open by a mob of police and their civilian deputies, right? And I know this is a celebration, and I'm so glad that we will have John Lewis College here, but I wanted to start with this visceral reality of terror for two reasons. One, because we're privileged to be in the presence of Cat Brooks, someone who spent the last years building a world in which no one will have to feel that terror again, right? And two, because when we think of John Lewis, what's the phrase that we think of? Not rhetorical. Will you think it? Say it again? Say it again, did you say? Good trouble, necessary trouble, right? We've heard of this, right? But I think we sometimes emphasize the good part, right? Without always honoring that there was nothing easy about the trouble that John Lewis was willing to get into. There's nothing easy about the sacrifices he made over and over to create a more just and livable world for us to live in. And so yes, John Lewis was a lawmaker. He was a funder. He ran a service learning program, right? He went to 1 million boring meetings. Who went to a boring meeting this week? Anybody? Did you? Oh my God, your meetings were, no one went to a boring meeting? Come on, Catherine, your hands up, right? And so he sat through those things, right? He made compromises, he celebrated achievements, and he also directly confronted the power of the state, even when that power was in his own hands. And so I think when he was giving advice to young activists, one of the things he told them was, go out there and get in the way, get in good trouble, necessary trouble, and be yourself. So in that sense, the pedagogy of John Lewis is one long lesson in how to get in the way, right? And that is one that he kept taking up. The last time he was arrested was more than 50 years after the first in 2013, right? When he was standing up for immigrant justice and pushing the Obama administration to have a real path to citizenship for our community members. Not because civil rights was over and he moved on to the next thing, but because he knew that immigrant justice is racial justice, right? And he knew that he had to keep getting in the way. And so that's the question I have for all of us today. And then I want to keep asking myself, how am I getting in the way, right? How have I gotten in the way today, particularly for those of us in this room who are here because we have some access to be able to make choices that impact each other's lives. And I really want us to take that in because we have the opportunity to gum up the works. And it may not be fun, right? And it may not always look like getting in a police car, but the invitation is to slow things down, right? And flummox common sense in the service of the greater good. And there's, so being what Sarah Ahmed might call a killjoy, right? And in the service of that, I feel like there's no one better than Dr. David Anthony, the future Dr. Andrea del Carmen Vasquez, and the real people's mayor of Oakland, Cat Brooks, to tell us something about what it means to get in the way in a good way. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up our panelists. Thank you.
I'm just looking for my script. Thank you. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? I'm David Anthony. I teach in the history department within the humanities division. So I'm kind of a guest. I work on continental Africa and its diasporas, including African America, with emphasis on social, cultural, and faith expression as these function within democratic movements seeking social change, societal change. When I was presented with the task of doing a lightning talk, I decided to name this Lightning John. So what do we say that is appropriate for the inaugural event to commemorate the Honorable John Robert Lewis College? First, it's vital to look past the university as a corporation, masquerading as a community, and to focus on the collective and its pedagogical mission to create stakeholders whose commitment is to bettering the world. What was John Lewis as a collegian? John Lewis had multiple higher educational institutional experiences. The first was in the former American Baptist Theological Seminary, now since 1971, American Baptist College, which he attended and from which he graduated as an ordained Baptist minister in 1961. And if you've listened to any of the talks that John Lewis did, he talks about his relationship to preaching, how he used to preach to chickens. Subsequently, he went to Fisk University in Nashville, where he earned a BA in religion and philosophy. Each educational experience was critical to his development. They were related. ABTS gave an introduction to the movement, as its Reverend Kelly Miller Smith introduced him to Vanderbilt divinity student James Lawson, a mentor in Gandhian nonviolence. Later, Lewis met Septima Clark and Miles Horton of Highlander Folk School of Mont Eagle, Tennessee. I just took myself out of myself. I lost my page. So I'm going back to old school. That institution, Highland Folk School of Mont Eagle, existed from 1924 to 1962. On March 29th, 2019, Highlander's Newmarket, Tennessee administrative building holding documents and memorabilia was deliberately burned to the ground. Now, I mentioned this in relation to its role as an institution that was involved in the revolutionary pedagogy for the movement, because the fate of that building, the loss of those documents, and the vestige, the physical vestige, if you will, of the repository of the history is kind of like the threat that has been leveled at historically Black colleges and universities in the past month, in which every one of them has been threatened with destruction. So that we're not very far away from the threats, from the opposition, from the haters, from the people who really don't want to see progress. So even in institutions, let us not be complacent. Let us not think that we are safe. To those who are still discovering the life and work of John Robert Lewis, I recommend his autobiography, Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement, and the vast number of vid clips and other materials available on the web. One, an hour-long intimate conversation on C-SPAN, offers a glimpse into his warm, committed approach to his practice. Done on the 40th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington, it situated him relative to the movements of his time while he could look back and forward as a member of Congress representing his home state of Georgia, it afforded ample time to answer audience questions. And you really get a sense of who this person was at his mature moment. But of course, he was still not done. He had other things to do, and he did them. I mention this to urge, in fact, exhort people who are part of the John R. Lewis College to learn as much as possible about the conditions and circumstances that gave rise to the movement in which he and his fellow activists were involved. This is not a matter of nostalgia, but a recognition of what they faced, just as what was just indicated. How they were trained, how they trained one another and others to participate in processes of social change. It is not a matter of looking back for its own sake, but an illustration of the old saw, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know where you've been. Context for that is provided by Maya Angelou, who was quoted as having said, "I have great respect for the past. If you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. I have respect for the past, but I'm a person of the moment. I'm here, and I do my best to be completely centered at the place I'm at. Then I go forward to the next place." Let us approach the renaming and dedication, indeed rededication, to those principles with that spirit, gazing back to look and move forward. John Robert Lewis, his bold path, valiant odyssey, and stalwart example can help guide us to do that vigilantly and humanely. John R. Lewis did that until the day he transitioned, left us. Let us then honor his living memory through our engagement. In a movement, and this is for those of us who came from some distance or under the special circumstances of parking, we might have gotten some parking certificates. And I got one that said VIP. In a movement, everyone is a VIP. Every foot soldier, a luminary at the barricades. Stand the storm. La lucha continua. La lucha continúa. La victoria es cierta. La victoria es certa. Victory is certain. That's necessary trouble.
I'm a little short, so you know, it's gonna be my hair that comes up and like the so yeah. I'll just do that. I'll just do this. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah. So I am Andrea Carmen Vasquez, most commonly known as Dre, graduate student in the Department of Education and in Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. And I am going to tell you a story because storying is how I think about my research. But I'm going to start with a quote by Carter Woodson. So it goes, "How some of these slaves learn in spite of opposition makes a beautiful story. Knowing the value of learning as a means of escape and having longing for it too because it was forbidden. Many slaves continue their education under the adverse circumstances." And this is Carter Woodson from The Negro in Our History, particularly the 1922 version. So here we go. Kiki entered the room in her mustard vintage knit sweater that matched the hair tie on her bun. As she walked toward her desk, the teacher asked, "So how'd it go?" Kiki, without a hint of surprise, but with a smirk of satisfaction, said, "Really good. I saw on the monitor that I was #1, but I'm not supposed to know." Kiki had won first place in the school's poetry contest and was going to rep La Villa High in the county's competition. If she won, like she had the year before, she was headed to state. The first time I talked to Kiki, I did so because I heard her quietly gossiping with her best friend in Spanish. On this particular day, however, from quiet and after a few requests, she performed her favorite poem for her peers. She told me she had chosen Hip Hop Gazelle by Patricia Smith because the poem described her body and her love for dancing, and because it reminded her of what it felt like when she would go on drives with her brother to the nearby slough, listening to Tupac and eating tacos before he was incarcerated. And indeed, a rhythm sense of joy radiated from Kiki as she embodied Smith's words and started the poem. "Gotta love us brown girls, munching on fats, swinging blue hips, decked out in shells and splashes. Lottie, bring them woo hips." Within the silence of her classmates' attention, Kiki brought to the physical world a curriculum of Black being. Her words, more than the extracurricular activity, are Kiki's foundation to speak herself into being. A young Black girl in a Mexican immigrant town, living in the afterlife of the colonial mission state of Califas. But Kiki's words do much more. They outline a pedagogy that recuperates a set of politics and relations that center the urgency of life-affirming practices, even in the places where her existence has never been thought of. No wonder Kiki's peers were speechless with her performance. Her embodiment of Smith's poem was not the ordinary lesson on Black life in the United States, the one they learn in US history and teaches about freedom in the United States through enslavement as a historic event rather than a social structure. Instead, they were witnessing and learning from the materiality of the Black lived experience. In order to fully understand Kiki's words, I must remind everyone that space is central to racialized students' interplay and negotiation with power. More than 16 years since John Lewis and other Black students asserted their right to service at food diners, racially segregated geographies of school opportunity remain largely intact. For the majority of youth from racialized communities, these segregated geographies contradict notions of schools as spaces independent from structures of racial oppression and a site of liberatory possibilities. In this way, the interplay between geography, race, and schools is productive and successful in teaching youth their position in racial hierarchy as outlined by white supremacy. For example, in the context of La Villa High, where Kiki goes to school, 96% of the student body identifies as non-Black Latinx, sorry. And 80% identify, or 80% qualify for free and reduced lunch. Villa High perfectly mirrors La Villa in its distinctive, disposable, yet essential Latinx population, a contrast to the rest of its white county. For these reasons, many youth at La Villa High pay homage to their town's long history of racialized social activism, naturally inspiring youth to rep La Villa as an act of resistance to white hegemony. However, for many Black youth in agricultural California, segregated geographies mean navigating landscapes often overdetermined not just by whiteness, but also by the likes of Chicanx nationalist ideologists. This settler colonial legacy, driven by the American dream of owning property and taking claim to space as a right of citizenship, continues to be the central motivation for many working class students in La Villa. However, it's this narrative of La Villa as a Mexican farm working town that fails to make anti-Blackness obsolete because it naturalizes the binary between Latinx migrant and white residents, often leaving Black life outside the parameters of La Villa's special imaginary. Indeed, when I asked a teacher why they thought students made anti-Black jokes, they answer, and I quote, "I think it's because our students are very sheltered and we don't have many Black students in the school." Kiki then, at a state level slam competition repping La Villa, was complete anarchy. In the fire of anarchy, Kiki was. Later that year, one of her elective classes, I witnessed how Kiki explained to Elena, a quote unquote high achieving student, that the hashtag Black Lives Matter wasn't saying that other lives matter less. Rather, it was a way to bring attention to, I quote, and this is in the Kiki's words, how cops like to fuck with people because we were slaves, end quote. Half astonished and half embarrassed, Elena took a pause, and before Kiki could begin to explain again, she simply said, "Oh, I get it. My bad, fam. I didn't know." In that moment, I witnessed how through soaring the violent relationship of difference between the history of Blackness and her classmates' idea of equality, Kiki enunciated a respect for Black life over and against the persistent violence of her peers' internalized white supremacy. In other words, in historizing the popular hashtag, Kiki offered a new lens to her peers to unravel and contend with their own white supremacy, while at the same time offering them a new orientation to be in a relationship with her. In this way, Kiki exemplifies how education as a coming to consciousness is in fact liberatory and extends from a sociality, a community. However, only time could demonstrate how these small quotidian discussions were going to amount to a practice of education as freedom in the flesh and bone. And it did. A year later, and following the death of George Floyd, when community members at La Villa organized a rally for Black life, Elena and Kiki were there. Amidst nostalgic conversations between old Mexicanos and their ranchero hats, generations of community organizers gathered to pay their respects to those whose lives were lost too soon to police brutality. Though not big in numbers, the space had depth with well-respected elders in the mix. And so when one of the seasoned organizers started chanting Brown Lives Matter and Migrant Lives Matter, Elena was ready. With Kiki standing nearby, Elena interrupted the call and response that the organizers had started by shouting, "This isn't about us. This is about violence against Black people." Soon enough, other students, both Black and non-Black Latinx, joined the chaos and started the first of many emotionally charged discussion circles. I returned to a few lines of Kiki's favorite poem. Like something boneless, we glide silent, seeping between floorboards, wrapping around the hymns, ooh wee, clinging like blue hips. It's in the slippage, the seeping between the floorboards, that slave learning in spite of opposition, like Woodson described in the opening quote of this talk, that Kiki plays. In her case, however, the magic is not in the learning itself, but in the capacity to transmit that wisdom in spite La Villa's social construction of Black death. For Kiki, knowing the value of learning a Black life was not enough. Her peers had to know. Otherwise, there would be no move towards liberation. When I think about Kiki, like other Black girls in La Villa, I am reminded of Harriet Jacobs' autobiography entitled Incidents in the Life of Slave Girl. Incidents documents Harriet Jacobs' life as a slave, including how she gained freedom for herself and for her children by hiding in an attic for several years. The twist, however, is that Jacobs' hiding place was located within a house in the very plantation she had escaped from. From this liminality, Jacob writes that the attic was her loophole of retreat, an enclosure that was simultaneously a space for enacting practices of freedom, practices of thinking, writing, and discerning letters, and imagining new forms of liberation. I think of this often because I ask, but really is Kiki who props this question with the very condition of her Black existence? Where are her boundaries of her loophole? When does she come out? Who does she take with her in her escape? And with these questions, I leave you, loopholing within Kiki's pedagogy. Thank you.
Hello. I think we have some tech things that need to. New. All the way up to the top. No, this is it. Yeah. It's just there. Just go there. All right. My name is Kat Brooks. I am the co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project and the executive director of the Justice Teams Network. In addition to that, I am a playwright, director, actress, advocate, organizer, and most importantly, I'm a sacrifices. They made such small progress. And by that, I mean the day-to-day, the lived existence of Black folks in America remains incredibly dark. I make a lot of trouble. Whether it's received as good or not largely depends on who you talk to, right? Folks in the flatlands of Oakland, yay, cats making trouble again. Police officer associations, not so much. That is Angel Ramos. I'm gonna spend my talk bringing the names, some of the names of the folks who have lost their lives to the state. It's Angel Ramos, murdered by the Vallejo Police Department in January of 2017. The Vallejo Police Department holds the title of the most murderous police department in Northern California. That used to be the Oakland Police Department, but we made a lot of trouble and ended that trajectory. The Vallejo Police Department holds badge bending ceremonies and barbecues when they kill people. And members of that department have been linked to white supremacist organizations and militias. Before I go too much further, I'm going to take a moment, and I do mean a moment because this is a lightning talk and time is short, for the lives that we've lost. Law enforcement in America kills approximately 1,200 people every single year, the vast majority of those people being Black, brown, and indigenous. This is Mario Woods. He was executed in San Francisco in 2015 by the SFPD, shot 27 times in broad daylight. His big crime was walking down the street in the middle of a mental health crisis with a kitchen knife. One of the deflections, one of the ways that they like to come for us is they say that we don't care about the other kinds of violence happening in our communities, but what we're clear about is that all violence is state violence, and it's the state that fosters the conditions for all of it to take place. That's our mission. And that is Atiana Jefferson. She was gunned down in her home by a police officer in October 2019, also in the middle of a mental health crisis. I don't know if I mentioned, almost half of all people that are murdered by law enforcement are in the middle of a mental health crisis, begging the question desperately why we respond to situations that need compassion and care with badges and guns. People ask about our name a lot. Why do you call it terror? That's literally the definition of policing. Law enforcement in this country was born to maintain the institution of chattel slavery. Their job then was to catch, kill, and incarcerate Black folks in the name of race-based capitalism. They continue to do their job today. In the North, they were launched in an effort to crush the first labor movements and unions. It's important to understand that police are the frontline enforcers of the status quo of America's special brand of white supremacy. They protect it at all costs with unmitigated levels of violence against Black bodies. And they'll do anything, right? Even lie, right? And I want to give an example of that because it's really important to understand what you're hearing in mainstream media right now is that the defund movement has been defeated or that we're done organizing. No, what is happening is a nationally orchestrated disinformation campaign between local governments, mainstream media, and police officers associations to manipulate the hearts and minds of Black and brown people that are living through the violence created by the economic pandemic that came on the heels of the coronavirus pandemic, and they're blaming a defund movement that never happened for that violence in a desperate attempt, right, to hold on to the lie that they can keep us safe. Oakland is a perfect example of this lie, where the Oakland Police Department actually received an uptick of $38 million to their $350 million budget. $18 million, not of their money, but $18 million went to prevention. Prevention means crime doesn't happen in the first place. And they called that defund and blamed us. APTP is busy. I think that I work with the dopest organizing team in the country. We support families, right? This is critical and core to our work and was part of why we launched in the first place. And we support families from the moment that they lose their loved ones to as long as they want to rock with us. And it's everything from running to the grocery store and mowing lawns to organizing support, legal support, communication support, fundraising support. There's a weekly family support group where we develop their skills so they can take their rightful place as true leaders in this movement. We train communities in rapid response and how to investigate incidents of state violence in their own communities. We've trained untold numbers of organizations across the country. When we first started, we didn't do reform. We didn't do policy. Reform means to fix. Policing is not broken. You cannot fix it. If you do not believe me, think with me for a moment at any time period that policing worked for everybody equitably in this country. I'll wait. That part. But we do engage, however, and we came to this because of the tide of Black and brown bodies falling at the hands of law enforcement. We realized that it had to be all roads in, right? So we engage in radical reform, read rational reform. And what that means is that we only engage in reforms that chip away at the status quo, right? So we don't support body cameras. We don't support, I don't know how many more millions of dollars we're gonna waste on diversity training, right? You can't train your way out of white supremacy. You have to dismantle it, right? We do support things like AB 352. We co-sponsored that legislation, changed the use of force policy for the first time in 150 years in what's supposed to be progressive California. We do support things and co-sponsor bills like 1421, the Right to Know Act, which now gives access to families, advocates, journalists, right, to records of the investigations around excessive uses of force. The Crisis Act, which is going to take state dollars and put it into the hands of grassroots organizations that are developing alternative models to community crisis that don't lead with a badge and a gun. Chip, chip, chip. SB 2, we can now decertify police. That simply means if you rape or kill someone, you can't make a lateral move and continue to rape and kill people while you still maintain your badge and gun. We use communications as a strategy and not a tactic. We've got to impact the public debate. We have got to be consistently pushing back on the propaganda. We've got to push back on the lie of policing that we're lulled into from infancy, that their job is to keep us safe. Healing justice. The school of organizing that I was raised in said, drink, smoke, work, die. One of the gifts of the Black Lives Matter movement and this influx of youthfulness into our work is this conversation around sustainability and healing. Right? And the truth is, if we don't sustain our organizers, you cannot sustain a movement. And if we are not addressing the trauma of our communities inflicted just by getting up and going to work and school or whatever else you have to do, right? That we absorb into our bodies and DNA. If we don't address that, then we certainly cannot expect people to be joining us in the streets to struggle for liberation when they're trying to hold on to their meager paychecks and their minds. And build new paradigms. We do need public safety mechanisms, for sure. That is not what abolitionists are saying, right? That's more BS, deflective talk. But policing does not do that. Our job as organizers has got to be to build, and we say small replicable models, right, of public safety that we can show the people, that we can cull data from, that we can tweak. And when we have enough of these eventually, right, creates a tipping point. We created Mental Health First as our first attempt at that. Oakland and Sacramento's only non-911 response to mental health crisis. And we're training and consulting with cities and even city governments and grassroots organizations across the country. That's Richard Perkins. He was murdered by the Oakland Police Department in November of 2015. We refer to 2015 as Bloody 2015 because that is the year that the Oakland Police Department murdered 11 Black men. That's almost one a month, and nobody was held accountable. We worked very closely with Richard's mom, Ada, an elder woman. She was walking home. Richard was murdered catty corner at the gas station from their house. She stood at that corner and looked at that body bag and prayed for the mother whose son was laying on that sidewalk, not knowing she was praying for herself. I spent a lot of time recently thinking about how making trouble turns into solutions, because God, I'm tired. Right. I'm also exhausted with the taste of tear gas. I'm gonna let the next generation do that. I want to do some of this work, right? This is not an exhaustive list, but there are steps that we can take to eradicate state terror as the norm in our lives. First, we need to admit it's happening because despite, right, hundreds and hundreds of videos of Black bodies being gunned down in the streets, there are still large swaths of the American population that think that Black people had nothing better to do than make up a genocide. We need a zero tolerance policy. There's got to be forced accountability from law enforcement, right? If you are not forced to take accountability for what you're doing, then why stop, right? If they know they can murder us with impunity, why stop? We need to be having conversations about what police do and actually do. Police do not stop or interrupt crime, prevent crime. They respond to it after the fact. We're talking about getting to the gun before the bullet flies. We're tired of putting our babies in the ground. We need to enact radical, irrational reforms. This is a conversation about redefining, reimagining public safety. What does that actually mean? What could it actually look like? And how beautiful will it be to collectively create that for our communities together? Demilitarize law enforcement. Yvette Henderson was murdered in February of 2015 on the West Oakland-Emeryville border. She was shot within 7 seconds of police arriving with an AR-15. Why are police rocking through our communities with AR-15s? Data shows the more militarized the police department is, the more violent, the more bloody that police department is. Develop alternative models and tear down the whole damn thing and rebuild. You know who that is. That's George Floyd, murdered by then Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who kneeled on his back for almost 9 minutes while he screamed for his mother and wailed, "I can't breathe." Since his murder, while the trials have taken place, Minneapolis law enforcement have killed 2 more people, including teenager Dante Wright, who was unarmed, who got pulled over because he had an air freshener hanging from his mirror, and Amir Locke, who slept on his couch during a no-knock warrant. The only non-academic that's joining with you today, thinking about pedagogy and what it means to movement, to Black liberation. A lot of folks, including me, get college degrees. Now, granted, my college degree was in theater. I used it for toilet paper when I couldn't afford none, trying to make a living as an actress in Los Angeles. But a lot of folks, right, they get degrees in this or that, and then they go take jobs as directors of nonprofit organizations, collecting fat salaries to do this work. Nothing wrong with that. I want our folks to get paid, right? And we still ain't making as much as white directors of nonprofits. That the problem comes, right, when folks fall into the false belief that they are better and more informed experts than the people that they are trying to serve. When we look down at what the Black Panther Party called the lumpen, right? The masses who feel the boot of white supremacy on their neck the strongest, the hardest, the most viciously. Education is a privilege, and if you have it, your job is to take it back to the masses and share. Your job while you're here is to continuously ask the question, who is academia actually serving? What status quo is it maintaining or reinforcing? Where does it sit on the continuum of white supremacy? Part of why I come back here every year is because of the small number of Black students who ask me to, who deal with micro, macro aggressions every day on this progressive campus that interrupt their educational experience. That is Natasha Mckenna. She was tased to death inside of the Fairfax County, Virginia jail. Her last words, while she was in the middle of a schizophrenic episode, she was set to be transferred out of that jail. Her last words were, "You promised you wouldn't kill me." That's how you find me.
Wow, wasn't that an incredible set of speakers? So as folks come up, let's just give folks one more round of applause. And then just for a logistics check, who has the Zoom questions or who will have those? Oh, awesome. That's Kristen, we have Zoom questions. So thank you so much for all the ways that you have opened this up for us. Kat's gonna be back in a moment, but I really wanted to take us back to that. It was just such a clear image you gave us, Dr. Anthony, every foot soldier, a luminary, right? And thinking about what that means and what it means to be not looking at a star, right, or one bright thing, but really to look at a universe of light, right? And for each of us to be kind of connecting all these different constellations. And I also really appreciate that you took us through a little bit of Representative Lewis's institutional history, right? Yes, Fisk, American Baptist College, but also the Highlander Center. And there's all these places that shape our practice in the world. And I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about the three of you and what are the places, the communities that really shaped your practice? And both as intellectuals, as activists, as creative folks, you know, what are these communities or these institutions that shaped your consciousness? If you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's a very poignant question. Because actually, my practice really began in the household in which I grew up. The example that was set for me was by my parents, my mother, my father, and my maternal grandmother, all of whom gave me certain very distinctive standards. My mother gave me a sense of the importance of doing the work and of doing it completely. And my father introduced me to an entire body of literature of vindicators, you know, people like the author of World's Great Men of Color. The sense to which there was an alternate view of our circumstances as people of African descent, that we were in fact making ourselves. So the person I had in mind, J. Rogers, Joel Augustus Rogers, was a person who was what would be considered an amateur historian, which is to say that he taught himself. And as a vindicator, a person whose role it was to conquer the calumnies, the dissent that was leveled at people of African descent, not just in the United States, not just in the Americas, but from Africa outward, you know, to really talk. So there was a part of that process that involved engaging with who we were in terms of the way that we had defined ourselves. And then my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was one of those foot soldiers. She was a rank and file person. But she was also had a very interesting biography, because she came from Oklahoma and she had gone to Swift Memorial, and then she went to Wilberforce. You know, she told me about translating Julius Caesar, you know, all of these things. And she took me to a meeting of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History when I was about 12 years old, which was in effect my first professional conference, right? And in the audience, I remember somebody standing up and saying, "When are we going to stop referring to ourselves by that slave named Negro?" And that person was a man by the name of Richard B. Moore. And if you look up Richard B. Moore, you will know that he was one of the stalwarts of Caribbean consciousness in Harlem in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. He was right there, you know. So my grandmother was planting the seeds for what was going to become an academic career, and I didn't know. You know, I was thinking about other kinds of things. So in an institutional sense, the standards, the models that I had that started off in the home took me in a lot of other directions. And I think that that's also interesting when I think about some of the stories that John Lewis told, because he starts off with his surroundings, you know, and then everything else kind of flows from them, you know. So when I think about other institutions and other movements that I was involved in, a lot of them, you know, were connected to schools of one kind or another, but the animus really came from that set of values that emerged within that home. My grandmother was a club woman as well, you know, and so she was involved in a church, Concord Baptist Church, is the largest Baptist church in Brooklyn, and did all kinds of social work, gave scholarships for kids, and, you know, just a very, very active person and a very humble person, and yet a very committed person. So I think those elements really had a lot to do with my practice, and they led me into the anti-apartheid movement and the Free South African movement, and, you know, all kinds of other things. And eventually they led me to Tanzania and Southern Africa and some other things. So that was my institutional home.
Absolutely. I know that's right. And so welcome back, Kat. we're in the conversation thinking about the spaces that shaped our practices and shaped our consciousnesses, right? And so I'm thinking about you, Dre, thinking about how La Via shapes both Kiki and Elena as community pedagogues, right? Can you speak about some of the spaces that shaped your consciousness and your practice?
Yeah. You know, I come from a migrant family, everyone from Latin America. My dad is, you know, your quintessential ranchero from, you know, the middle central Mexico. And my mom's Black Ecuadorian. And so I spent a lot of time trying to make sense of what the hell was going on in their kitchen table, really. To be honest, I mean, like, you eat tacos with Ecuadorian encebollado, it does not look Mexican, right? Like, I did not have your quintessential Mexican experience, and I didn't have your Black American experience. I had a very Black Latinx South American life. And so I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, a space that is primarily Black and Latinx with a long history of activism against LAPD. And so it was those interactions of seeing the cops stop my dad and seeing the cops stop my Black friends and seeing the cops try to figure out what to do with me, right? That really kind of started helping me ask questions about race, particularly trying to understand what was my role in that discussion and the ways in which I upheld or deconstructed certain things. It was just that really honest conversation. And so when I got to La Villa, which is a space that is very similar to where a lot of my family lives, it was just in my face, everything about their interactions, the way they thought about, you know, race, not just Latinidad, but Blackness, right? It was very clear to me. And I think in part because, you know, the Black students gravitate to Blackness, right? So they all looked at me and they're like, what's up, yo? Like, you know, and so it was really the kitchen table, I would say, in my house, where we were having conversations about, you know, having to learn more English or not knowing, like, right, like strategizing around, you know, language and things like that, because, you know, somebody had had this experience with the cops and we needed to get it together. And so I would say that for me, it was definitely my hood and definitely lots of conversations in the kitchen table that really shaped and gravitated, you know, my orientation to some extent.
So I think the first place is where I was born and raised, which is Las Vegas, Nevada, 46 years ago. And folks think a lot of, you know, you think of the casinos and the girls and all that stuff, but actual people live there. And the thing to know about Las Vegas is that it was run by the Mormons, the mob, cowboys, and it was segregated. I was born to a white mother and a Black father at a time when I was not the business. And they lived on opposite sides of town. My mother in the poor white area of Las Vegas, my father and my granny in the poor Black area of Las Vegas. And so I grew up hearing stories, right, about cops taking Black folks to the desert. My father was the first Black stagehand in Las Vegas. He also suffered with a serious substance abuse problem. Got pulled over a lot. I watched him beaten by law enforcement. First time I was threatened with rape was by a Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officer. So that's that, right? The macro. The micro would be my granny's home, right? And growing up, literally opening the refrigerator and there being a Schlitz beer in there and maybe a thing of government cheese. And my mother's home, who was on the front lines of the domestic violence movement in Las Vegas, again, 40 plus years ago, very different business there. I remember when the gun and the bullet went through the window where she sat at her desk. But there was a very political home, right? There were Ms. magazines all over the place and women's circles with guitars. And so I grew up hearing politics from my mom and her friends, but also from my granny, right? Southern Baptist Church in segregated Las Vegas was politics. When my father was stolen from me by the state, I was 8, 9-ish years old. I knew that my father had an issue with substance abuse. I knew that he was sick. And I was really clear that he wasn't gonna get better in a cage, right? Like, I don't remember how my 8 or 9-year-old mouth formed those words, but I knew that he was in the wrong place. And I've spent the rest of my life trying to recover from the impact of my father being stolen from me, because when we still families, when we still parents from children, right? We're creating a pathway for those children and emotional trauma that is very difficult to recover from. The next place I would say would actually be a university, right? I wanted to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. I wanted to tell our stories. I wanted to talk about injustice. I want to write. I also love Shakespeare, real spit. But you try to navigate, right? A theater department in Las Vegas, try to find space to get equal time as a black person. And I had, instilled in me, I actually think I was born with it, this idea, this is right and this is wrong. Right. And then there was some politicization that happened because of my mom. My mom gave me a ton of books, right, on being Black in America. And then my next place, I ended up landing at Community Coalition in South Central Los Angeles under the direction of Karen Bass before she ran for Congress. And I say I am because she is, right? That's where I was politicized. That's where I learned about dialectical materialism. That's where I learned how white people build wealth. That's where we took 8 weeks out of the year for Black leadership to get together and study movement, right? That is my political home. And then lastly, I would say the town, right? Then by some wild card, I ended up in Oakland, right? The birthplace of the Black Panther Party that has a culture of resistance and revolution. And a year after I moved there, Oscar Grant was murdered. And he was murdered on January 1st, 2019. I think I skipped over his slide. And I had been in Las Vegas. And I came home and I was getting ready to turn down the street onto my block, and I had my little baby with me. And this brother flagged me down and asked me where the rally was. And I had no idea what he was talking about, because just one state over, it was a complete blackout on Oscar's murder, let alone the rebellions that were taking place in the street. I went upstairs and I was holding my kid, and I turned on social media, and there was Oscar's execution. And I fell apart, right? He wasn't the first black man. In fact, the first case of police violence I worked on at Coco was the 14-year-old kid who couldn't barely see over the steering wheel that stole a car, and LAPD fired at least 60 rounds into that vehicle and killed that child. But I got physically ill. I couldn't stop crying, and decided I was gonna volunteer at night, right? I had my 9 to 5, and then a lot of organizers, we have 5 to 9, we volunteer our time, and I volunteered on his campaign, having no clue what that was gonna mean for the rest of my life. But being in the town and making a choice when I moved to the town to immediately connect, right, with other organizers and folks who were fighting for Black liberation. First organization I worked with was the Black August Organizing Committee, supporting our relatives on the inside. Yeah, the town has done the final molding, I guess, in the creation of Cat Brooks, and the journey that I continue to walk.
Right, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all taking this time to really walk us through the kind of political and intellectual homes that aren't necessarily going to show up on the bio, right? So the kitchen table may not be in the bio, right? The brother who flagged down your car might not be there, right? That moment, you talk about full circle. So Dre, you started us with Carter G. Woodson, who not only is the founder of Negro History Week, now in Black History Month, but this isn't officially a Black History Month event, it's a Black History Month event, right? Is also the founder of what is now ASALH, an Association for the Study of African American Life and History, right? Which is where you started us. And so I think that the fact that we don't know how far these ripples are going to travel, right? And I think when you talk to us about college as one of these kind of cauldrons for consciousness that you had, Kat, right? So many folks right here on our campus are in a college. We're trying to make it through our everyday life, and we may not know what class we're taking or what lecture we're offering that's really gonna produce those ripples. And so I'm wondering if we can talk before we open it up. So folks in the chat, or I don't even know where the camera is that y'all can see. Folks in the chat, get your questions ready. But before we go to that, I'm wondering if we can kind of look to this context, this community of consciousness here at UC Santa Cruz. We're thinking about the legacy of John Lewis, right? If we're trying to be these foot soldier luminaries and we're trying to order our steps in the path of John Lewis, where is the direction to take this campus, right? What are marching orders that you see from your vantage point for us here at Santa Cruz to really manifest this legacy as John Lewis College?
Quick things to your point. I mentioned in my opening talk that I was a theater major. What I didn't mention is that I was a dance minor. I hobbled my ankle during rehearsal for Raisin in the Sun, which meant no more dance classes.
Walter Lees.
So I ended up taking, I did it. I ended up doing the show on crutches and with a, something that they give you for prosthetics. Anyway, not the point. Point is, I had to obviously not take any of my dance classes. So I ended up taking US policy in Latin America, African-American studies, and indigenous women voices. That was right the beginning of the end. And I also mentioned in my talk that part of why I come back every year is because of the small group of Black students that are on this campus. And the first year that I came, they literally, I mean, like I stepped off the stage, right? and what they wanted was validation. Mm-hmm. Not that they knew what their experience was, but they like, can you tell them, please? And actually, I think it was during the Q&A session, actually. Can you tell them? Can you talk to them about microaggressions? Can you talk to them about, right? They need a validation. And my heart was, I was right mad, but my heart was also breaking. And so, I'm only on this campus once a year, and we just had a 2-year break. But from my very outside vantage point, your Black students need support. Your Black students need to be heard. Your Black students need to not be under attack of it's hard enough making your way through college. You don't need to be trying to do that under the banner of micro and macro aggressions. And for the Black students in this room and the ones that are listening, call me, I still got you, right? It needs to be more than sailing Black Lives Matter signs, and there needs to be accountability of your staff, right? You adults that are responsible for cultivating a positive learning experience, to hold that for them, or with them, or believe them when they tell you this is what accountability and what they need. Let them lead and you actually follow. I know you may have more degrees than them right now, right? But if you're really going to talk about being one of the most progressive college campuses in the country, you've got to lean into the hard part of that pronouncement.
This is so moving. I'm at a kind of crossroads now, and I hope Robert Johnson is not going to lead me to the devil. But the crossroads for me is around my next act, because I've been here for a number of decades, and I know this road. I don't necessarily know what's ahead. But having been here since 1988, in the bad old 20th century, Yes, that's right. That's right. It's hard to believe that time existed. No, it's true. Well, one of the things that I've learned from being here is the importance of understanding the symbiosis, the synergy of teaching and the role of students, which is to say that it's a kind of dance, you know, and that the importance of that relationship is that it has to be reciprocal. That in order for teaching to occur, it has to be a two-way street in order for learning to occur. I remember the literary scholar and teacher, I'm forgetting his name right now, it'll come back to me, but he said, nobody really teaches anybody else anything. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we may be able to learn in one another's presence. And that was really important for me to hear and to try to act on, because coming into a situation, I came here from New York, but not directly from New York. I came here by way of Baltimore and Eugene, Oregon. I had taught in a bunch of places, but in a certain sense, by the time I got to California, I was a refugee from New York. You know, my formative experiences all came from New York. I went to New York University as an undergrad, and then from New York University, I parachuted into the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And from University of Wisconsin-Madison, I went to East Africa. So there were a lot of things that were happening at that time. And I was very, very fortunate. I have always felt fortunate to have been able to see these places, to see other people. And I think one of the things that became important to me is I grew up on a block in St. Albans, Queens, in which my community, which was 99% people of African descent, except for a couple of stalwart whites who decided they were not going to succumb to blockbusting. They were not going to leave. This was their community. This was their neighborhood. They were very unusual people, you know. On that block, there were teachers, there were civil servants, there were people involved in every activity. There was even a Black rabbi, you know. So my sense of diversity was very interesting, because it was also coded by the circumstances of, you know, you could say segregation in a sense, because that kind of led to that, right? But that's not all we were operating in. We were living in our own society, if you will. And the fact was that I had seen all of these people, I've interacted with all these people, I knew that people could do any number of things. So when I started to move into other spaces, I realized I was coming in contact with students who had never seen that kind of diversity, right? And so there were actually people who came to my office hours and just sort of looked at my books, you know, and then just said, can I just follow you? You know, can I just be with you? And it was the distance between having had a few doors open at a particular moment, and then taking with folks what happened at that particular moment, that became really, really critical. And then the other part of that is to say, look, I would like to share with you what I have learned, but I'm not necessarily going to tell you what to make of this and how you need to operate, you know. And especially the older I got, the more important that became, that humility to say, all right, well, what sense do you make of this? When I give this to you, when I open this up and we read this together, how do you read it? You know, and that I think has been very, very significant. You know, it has been very hard in a setting where the thing that I do, even though it is about a particular segment of the population, it's very, very difficult for those folks to get to my classes because they have other kinds of commitments, and sometimes people don't even know I'm here, right? So that is an issue. You know, the period that I was most successful was when I was provost of Oaks College, because I had visibility, and that led, you know, to certain kinds of things. So I think what it comes down to is being in a place where you can really, where I can really share what it is that I've been able to see. You know, the people that I spoke to, the places that I went, the things that I read, and to give that to another generation. That's part of my legacy, to move this along and say, okay, you're going to take this someplace else. We may not look at these things in the same way, but we still need to have these conversations. And you still need to recognize that this didn't start today.
So I know I'm getting the sign. We got to move to Q&A, but there's too much good stuff happening up here. Dre, do you have something you want to add to this before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what, 2022, 2 years ago. I think we finished the year with all those cops on campus. That's my addition. That's it. We can just go on to the queue. But I think it's important one of the things that I keep central to my work is that, or at the front, that helps me really kind of understand, is that like pedagogy and teaching is very relational. And so I think we learned a lot by the way in which institutions move, right? And the way in which institutions react to things, right? And so, yes, I think that, you know, as somebody who has the honor to work with CREST 68, which is Approaches to Black Studies, which is the Blackest class on campus, right? next to when you teach or somebody else teaches, right? Is Black, it's Black, right? And the constant conversation that we have is that it's how are we going to navigate the surveillance of this campus, and how are we going to set a tone in our class and where students learn based on this relation. When students ask themselves, how am I in relation to you? And how is that relationship life affirming? And how am I in relation to movements? That's the other question. And so, yeah, I mean, I think when you have all that quantity of militarized personnel on campus and it's all over the news, like as a student, why would I go to that school? So it's foundational, key things like that that are just bigger than what we can do in the classroom. It's definitely structural at times.
See, from thinking about that structural piece to really mourning not just the Black world, but a Black universe. You're talking about a Black universe and possibility we were raised in, that for better or worse, most of our students, particularly at Santa Cruz, particularly students in California, I'm from Philadelphia, and maybe I didn't grow up in a Black universe, but I grew up in a Black world of possibility, right? Trained in the Black theater tradition, right? And I remember one of my first courses I taught was queerness and Black popular culture. There's maybe over-enrolled, maybe 60 students. And my first row was all Black students, or maybe 8 Black students. It was my first year teaching here. And I was like, oh, okay, you know, I'm thinking that is not a lot of Black students, right? And at the end of my first class, I was like, oh gosh, I gotta do some more recruitment. I'm thinking that there's some kind of crisis. And the students came up to me and said, we all know each other, and we've never had this space, right? They experienced it as such a bounty of Blackness, to have 8 students in the front row, to have that space, so to be able to recalibrate and see that we may not, maybe it's not a universe or a world, but creating satellites, planets of these opportunities to create community in a way that makes sense in this context, right? And so I really appreciate each of you for bringing the ways up that you've been doing that. And then we'd like to hear some questions from students here or online.
Okay, maybe we'll start with online. I'll read questions from 2 students on a related topic. The first is Kendra, who says, I'm an African-American carceral impacted undergrad student attending UC Santa Cruz. I am beyond appreciative to be part of this opportunity and be in the same space as Kat Brooks. But Kendra wants to know, how can I and my peers within the Santa Cruz community get involved with the anti-police terror project? And the related question from another student, Daniel, is, I'm curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on the issue of body cameras for police. I have seen body camera footage be useful in holding police accountable for their actions, but I also read that they can be very expensive to maintain, and I am uneasy about the idea of trying to combat police brutality by investing more money in police departments.
I'll just roll one into the other. First of all, Kendra, thank you so much. I'm gonna tear up a little bit. I'm gonna flip the question though, because actually it's not about how y'all can get involved with us, it's how we can get involved with you, right? Our job is to support y'all. And that has looked different ways. That has looked, like, you know, me come to speak, but that has also looked, right, having organizing support calls to support campaigns that have taken place on campus. That has looked like supporting the research, in particular, Black students on campus. You know, organizing is new and different in this time of COVID, but it is still super important. And you have this beautiful campus, you have meetings outside. Like, we're happy to provide trainings. We've sent people to come consult with some of the Black student groups. Like, that's what I want to do. I want to offer up, you know, our policy dude, James Birch, is a guru. Our comms team is amazing. Like, we want to give you an influx of trainings, resources, and support so you can build your campaigns and be a sounding board and support system. I don't mess with body cameras. And the part of the problem with body cameras is that they give communities a false sense of accountability. And that actually more often than not, despite whatever is on the camera, right, it has absolutely no impact on police accountability, right? And the other thing to remember about body cameras is that it gives you the viewpoint of the police officer. It does not give you the viewpoint of the person that is being brutalized by the police officer. And I would just reiterate, right, that the policing cannot be fixed. It's not broken. It's got to be dismantled and reformed. And so I would love for us to get off of this rat wheel of infusing millions of dollars of taxpayer money, millions of dollars that could go to housing, education, you know, living wage jobs, trauma support, mental health resources, things that actually lead to safe communities, and stop investing our dollars in a violent system whose job is to maintain a violent status quo. You will never have peaceful communities. You will never get there by engaging violence. And so it's the wrong question, right? Yeah, to get us to where at least I'm trying, you know, and my folks and the folks that I rock with are trying to get us to be.
Because I think one thing about the body camera piece is that it makes it seem like the issues we just didn't know what happened. We didn't have enough evidence, right? And I don't think that the hundreds of years, starting from the very important work that Carter G. Woodson did, is a lack of evidence, right? So I think that's part of kind of one of the fallacies, which can be it makes sense. It does make sense. However, if you look at the actual history of Native and of Black struggles for justice, you'll see there's no lack of documentation, right? And so, and I think if you could ask a lot of folks, you could ask any Indigenous community about lack of documentation. That's not the issue, right? They'll pull treaties left, right, up, and down. And so I think that to me is the piece that's not that we need more documentation, we need to actually interrupt the kinds of violence that are happening and document and evidence, as we've learned over and over again through the pandemic, isn't what necessarily moves the needle, right? Evidence being right doesn't win the argument. And so it's kind of putting that out there.
There's a couple of other questions that bring us back to John Lewis and questions of strategy that I think are really interesting. From Anne, question for everyone. What advice do you have for students who might want to run for public office? Would you run for public office? Do you think we can really make changes from within the system and follow in John Lewis's footsteps? And the question that's paired with that is from a student, Moses, who asks, to what extent should we as Black students at UC Santa Cruz be cautious of celebrating John Lewis as an agent of these racist United States on a campus climate saturated with white liberal racism? Should our criticisms be private and curated? In whose house should we wear our masks?
Don't look at me. You're the one who I voted. You're the one who I voted for, Kat Brooks.
So I did run for office. In 2018, I ran for mayor of Oakland, and in unprecedented shock to all of us, including the state, ended up being the runner-up with 43,000 first place votes. I didn't run for office because I had any illusion about engagement with the state bringing about liberation, right? It's a tactic, part of a larger strategy. And I never would have run for office had I not been asked by the people. It was a particular political moment at a particular movement building time. And we have reaped the benefits, right? It was never about the seat. It was about impacting the public debate, and we successfully pulled neoliberal white folks screaming and kicking, right, to the left, right? And as a result, we were able to see things like now Carol Fife, Sister Carol Fife, who's District 3 City Council person who I've been organizing with, so if that tells you anything about her politics and ideology, for 15 years, right? It's dangerous to be lulled into the belief, I'm gonna say it again, that we're gonna get liberation from the state. It has been interesting, and I say this with all the love and respect. I know Karen Bass. She was my boss. I know she politicized me. It has been interesting to watch her from afar make decisions that I know are outside of her moral compass. It has been even more interesting, and decisions that disappointed me. The fact that there's not qualified immunity inside of the George Floyd bill, right? That we're even still having the conversation, like tank it, start off like then it's right, then it's performative, political masturbation. It's been fascinating watching Carol, my sister, navigate, right, close up, being a politician and a revolutionary. You actually can't be both at the same time. She's decided to maintain being a revolutionary, right, and continue to be accountable to the people. It is a sacrifice that I'm glad that I'm grateful that I'm not required to make. And it is through watching her actually that I've gotten super clear that it's not a sacrifice that I'm capable of making. The violence with which the state responds when you are sitting in those kinds of seats with actual power, have a platform and to move dollars, the attack on character, the threats to family, the blue flu that she's experiencing in her district. I mean, we're not a tribe that walks through the world scared, right? We stand up to riot lines and inhale tear gas, right? Like it's regular air. The amount of times that I've been scared literally for her life and remain scared for her life because she's inside of that dynamic. That said, we all have a place inside of the movement, right? And it's not going to be one strategy or tactic that gets us there. The fact is that we are governed by a body of laws and folks whose job it is to uplift those laws and sit in local, state, and federal offices, right? And impact right and implement legislation that governs the quality of our lives. And we need folks that are aligned with us in those seats. Right? It's on us. We can't elect them and leave them there and say, oh, well, they've got that. I'm gonna move on. Right? We've got to stay and help them remain accountable to us. Right? Because otherwise the pull is just too great. At the same time, we need to be building practices for self-determined communities. My goal is self-determination. Right? I'm not interested in engaging forever with this system who's been trying to kill me since it kidnapped, right, the first African and brought it to these shores to build its wealth. It's not going to change. And actually some of the fights that I have with abolitionists is the fairyland that they live in about whether America is going to change or kill us all first. I'm sorry. But they're never going to just sit down and be like, you know what, you're right. Our bad. Let us get about your way and build this equitable spot, right? And if we ever actually really are on the precipice of winning, we need to be really clear about the consequences of what that will be. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I guess it's yes, we need our folks in the seat. Just make sure you're the right person to sit in that seat. Right? Or are there other places for you to be inside a movement that's all roads in on the pathway to liberation? We need the warriors, the scholars, the politicians, the D boys, the D girls, the artists, right? Folks on both sides of the walls, the academics, the truth tellers, all of it.
Great. Your fellow student Moses wants to ask about where we wear the mask, and I think as the person who's experiencing life as a student right now, can you speak to that?
Second question, right, about critiquing the name. Well, was that it? It was great. That's a great
I'll
question.
read it again because I think it's important. To what
Moses, come be on the panel.
Yeah,
Where are
Moses, get up here.
Moses, get up here.
All right, so to what extent should we, as Black students at UC Santa Cruz, be cautious of celebrating John Lewis as an agent of these racist United States on a campus climate saturated with white liberal racism? Should our criticisms be private and curated? In whose house should we wear our masks?
Moses coming through, It's funny. I feel like I have these conversations with a lot of like the undergrads, or we've been having these conversations a lot. And similar to what Kat was saying, I think that there are truths that need to be held, right? Like that contradiction of having the name, right, to this college in a very white and very liberal university. But I don't know, part of me also wonders if we can use that as a tactic, right, and leverage that. And so I think that is the critique in itself, right? The fact that, I mean, like, why can't we have Black studies now? I mean, we should be able to have Black studies.
Minor.
We have a minor, but we don't have a major.
Oh, we don't have a major.
We don't have a major.
We don't have a major.
No. We don't got a DE in Black studies, right? Which we could, right? And so it's finding, for me, it's finding the ways to use that critique, because that critique is very real. And it's one that we should not be sidestepping, because every Black student in this campus can probably see it. So yeah, that's my short answer.
You looking at me?
Yeah, I'm looking at you. What do you think?
Moses, I can't wait to learn more about you, have these conversations in class. But this question you asked about in whose house we wear the mask, I think the question that goes with that is, as Black people in the Americas, when are we in our own house, right? And what does that mean? How much of that has to do with the John Lewis College, and how much of that has to do with the nature of existing and surviving in this hemisphere and all the languages and all the places that we do? And I think this is a question that isn't that I haven't found an answer to, but it's one that you keep asking over and over. And also, while we're on the topic of John Lewis, I think I did some asking around of folks who actually worked in his district and had to deal with him as an elected, because I come from the tradition in which your elected officials are your chosen, you vote because you get to choose your opponent, not because you choose your representative, right? And I have voted in every election since even in May, right? And so for folks who've actually worked with him, unlike other folks, Jim Clyburn or others who have made some maybe other interesting choices, when it came time to close the jail in Atlanta and folks were mobilizing, I talked to folks who helped who were trying to get the Atlanta jail closed, and they said he did not stand in their way. He said they said when they would come and lobby him on Capitol Hill, he would always make time. He would make sure that folks got the intros that they needed. When on lobby day, he prioritized young people, prioritized folks who were organizing in Atlanta, and that his desk was incredibly messy. And so just adding that in, that like, things weren't tied up in a bow, but I don't know that John Lewis is the worst of our problems if you're talking about agents of the state. And I say that as someone whose check comes directly from the state of California. And so also thinking about all the different kinds of agents of the state and taking responsibility for those of us who are part of the state machination, as is everyone who eats and drinks off and pays our rent or our mortgage, if you're lucky enough, off of this campus. And so I think I'm also hearing a call to accountability for those of us who are part of the state, and most of us, and I hope we'll all listen to that. Does anybody in this room have a question? It would be great to have our one last question from, oh, sorry,
I think it's a very important question. I think we should be cautious. One should be cautious. One should be vigilant. But I think we also have to make decisions on a case-by-case basis. If you are looking at the political process that has unfolded within this capitalist, racist, sexist, homophobic, we can go on, social formation, we also have a range of actors who have gotten involved and have exerted differing degrees of agency over a long period of time. Okay? This is not a 5-minute question, all right? And, you can go back to the moment that Frederick Douglass decided that he was willing to be a representative of the United States government, at a plenipotentiary, position, down to Bobby Rush or any number of other people. You've had lots of people. I grew up in New York City. Adam Clayton Powell was still in my childhood and until my early adulthood, a very major figure. It's very easy to take hard lines on folks, but you got to look at what it was that they came into, why they came into, what they attempted, what was possible, and where the needle was moved. I've been lucky, as I said, to have been both inside and outside of this country. And I remember in Tanzania, I met a Nigerian militant, a socialist revolutionary by the name of Omafume Onoge. And Onoge said, we need everything. We need reforms and revolution because our people are dying. And I think what it comes down to is that you have to choose your battlefield. And at different points in someone like John Lewis's life, he chose different battlefields. And there were points in time when people said, John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael said at a certain point, John Lewis, it's time for other direction within SNCC. And the basis of that was because this is from John Lewis, his sense that he was too close to Dr. King. And they wanted somebody who would be more critical of that generation and of that particular pitch for the movement. You know, so there are contradictions within movements that are sometimes generational. Right? There's lots of complexity. The essence of history, the essence of politics is complexity, right? So I don't think you want to whitewash, I don't want to say tar with the same brush, because you say tar, that's another problem, you know? But to say that everybody occupies the same position is oversimplification. And the most important thing to begin with is to study. So you really do need to look at the objective conditions in each situation before you make your appraisal of what it was. And you also have to look again at what people were facing. And we've already heard what John Lewis was facing, and everybody in the movement is facing life or death every single day. And even if you're not in the movement, you're still facing life or death every single day, especially at the hands of the police. So when someone decides that they are going to take on the role of running for office, they're taking their life in their hands. Don't kid yourself. You know, we can say all kinds of critical things about the Obama years, and rightly so. But you don't know how many death threats that man got because they suppressed that, right? And that's not saying that anybody gets a blank check. It's saying that one's life is on the line, especially a person of color, particularly a person of African descent. You know, even the people that you might not think are afraid of are fearsome, right? You go back to old Booker T. Washington, and there are stories about Booker T. Washington having his own train. And he had his own train because he was not going to subject himself to Jim Crow. So when they found out when he was moving, there was actually a lynching that occurred at the time that he was moving to make sure that he would see the body on his train. So let's not get it twisted. This is never light stuff.
Okay, absolutely. Do we have a closing question over here? Anyone?
There are more questions. I'm not sure what time we have. Maybe I'll just read this one comment from the audience because I think it's fitting at the moment. This is from Sean, who says, "Thanks for this program. I do not have a question at this time. I simply want to celebrate the tremendous panelists, their contributions today and always. Also, I want to specifically name how Dr. Anthony continues to be a tremendous pillar of and for UC Santa Cruz and is due all the flowers and accolades he can muster. Ashe."
I don't think I can say that any better, but I would like us to please join us in another round of applause to thank our incredible presenters tonight. We would also like to express our appreciation to all of you in this room and online for showing up and being part of this conversation. In the digital handout, we acknowledge the many people who made this evening possible. Our deepest gratitude to them all.
We'd also like to just take a brief moment to encourage you to continue to attend this series and continue to get into good and necessary trouble with us. March 2nd, in a couple of weeks, is our next event called Solidarities for Justice, followed by Spring Quarter, back-to-back weeks, 3 of them. March 30th, Social Movements for a Just Society. April 6th, Pathways to Thriving Communities, followed by April 13th, Students as Agents of Transformative Change. All events are Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Tune in online or VIP in person. If you get one of those invites, please join us. Those of you that are here this evening, please enjoy some food to go on your way out due to COVID restrictions. But then thank you again to our panelists and to all of you joining online. Thank you for joining as we commemorate John R. Lewis College. Thank you.